So what we're proposing with whole body breathing is that there is, first off, a breathing pattern that runs through the entire body on the inhale and the exhale. So the whole body breathes at once. And that also there's a motion of the spine and the bones that goes along with this breathing. Secondly, what we're proposing is that this is not an exercise. This isn't a new technique of breathing. What we're saying is that this is the primal breathing pattern. This is the underlying breathing pattern. And what we're doing is removing the blockages, we're removing compensation patterns that throw us off of our proper breathing pattern. Now, for this to make sense to me, this means that this breathing pattern should have some evolutionary evidence. If we're proposing that all of these structures are breathing structures, then we should be able to look into the evolutionary record and also our embryology to see how they could have evolved as breathing structures. So breathing is an exchange. It's how life interacts with its environment. It's how it takes in what it needs and how it expels what it doesn't need. For single cells and simple organisms, it's essentially everything. It's how, other than chemical interaction, it's how they get their nutrients from the outside and they expel waste back out. And then in more complex systems, you have, say, cardiovascular system or respiratory system or circulatory lymphatic systems, uh, cranial sacral fluid systems. All of these systems are built in complexity on top of the breath. But at their level, even what they're essentially doing is breathing. They're taking in something from their environment and expelling what they don't need back into the environment. All life breathes to some degree. And the mechanism of breathing may evolve, but what we're proposing is that although the mechanism of breathing evolves, at the fundamental level, it's the same breathing pattern that we've had from the start of life and even prior to life. So for the entire evolutionary journey and also for your entire embryological journey as well. Because remember, when you're in the womb, you can't actually breathe air, but you are breathing. So in this lecture, we're going to follow the breath all the way from early life, early embryo, before even the beginnings of form, into the early forms of life, into our early ancestors, fish, and then see how the same mechanism of whole body movement and also the bone movement carries through all the way up until present day, until the breathing that you're doing now. To simplify things greatly, matter is essentially a vibrationally slower form of energy, and there's some form to the energy after which the matter of the cells build around that scaffolding. So this is actually, if you see this video of a frog's face in development, the bright white lines that you see here are actually electricity. Those are nervous system electricity that forms, and then you can see the face of a tadpole here beginning to form, and it forms around where the electricity is first generated. So the idea of a scaffolding is it's in all of the major traditions of the world as well as craniosacral tradition. This picture on the right, you can see the idea of stillness, and then from stillness, there's some sort of movement of energy which generates a force. Then there's fluid cohesion and integration, and then the form organizes around that force. And this has been explained many times in, say, chakras, the torus field, the Sushumna. You have on the top right the Taoist field, the concept of energy channels, of an energy body, of chi, of prana, of nadis. This is in all cultures. This is in all forms of thought about this energy body, and it would also explain certain things such as, say, phantom limb syndrome. So, playing the video once again, we do have good evidence that in the development of a frog and in humans, that there is some sort of electrical generation first. Prior to the cells organizing themselves in that location, first the electrical signal develops, creates the form, and then the energy body is the scaffolding around which the rest of the form generates. Now, I say in humans too, because the central nervous system around which your entire body organizes, it communicates with, and then develops from, is an electrical system. Essentially, your entire body's functions rely on electrical signaling to some degree or another. Where the central nervous system, where the electrical signaling gets cut off, in many cases, that part of the body ceases to function properly. This electrical signaling is also known to be a big part of bone development. So the piezoelectric charge, which is when there's tension or compression across the bones, that piezoelectric charge signals the bone cells, osteoblasts, osteoclasts, which form and destroy bone. It's electrical signaling, which tells them to turn on and turn off. So what we're proposing and essentially restating what methodologies and traditions around the world have stated is that there's first an energy impulse, there's an energy scaffolding that the physical form organizes around, and also that the breath is driven by. So at this point, we have an energy impulse, an energy scaffolding that the body is built around, that is the first sort of impulse of life that life will organize itself around. Once we have life, you have to imagine the first cells in the ocean. We come out of oceans, we come out of bodies of water. A single cell doesn't really have any muscular capacity to breathe. There's a lot of chemical interaction for cellular respiration, but to actually get the nutrients to it, push them through the walls, and like sort of massage things through the cell and get them out to the other side, for all that internal movement to happen, all life requires water. All life is essentially floating in water to some degree or another. And you'd have to imagine this oceanic breath. Essentially, the tides and the motion of the ocean is what is breathing the organism. And at this early stage of life, the organism and its environment are almost functionally the same thing. The organism is being breathed. So this has been called the oceanic breath by people like Floyd, oceanic feeling. It'd be the same feeling as floating in the womb. It's called the great breath as well, oceanic breath. Once again, like these things have names. We're reiterating what's been already said in a lot of traditions. The Gormanati. This is the basic. So the impulse to breathe happens, and the impulse to breathe follows the breath of the environment. So they both happen at the same time. So it's not that you choose to breathe and you breathe separately from the environment. The entire environment breathes at once. And this is called the oceanic feeling, the oceanic breath. And it's been described as like what a baby would feel like in the womb, or even very early in childhood, where the baby still hasn't made a distinction between itself and the environment. You have to learn that this is my body, that is the camera. That distinction isn't there with you from the start. Initially, it's just a bunch of sensations. You're floating in an ocean of sensation. So the breathing, the exchange with the environment is essentially happening. And as you can see on the right side, this is a core part of cranial sacral theory as well. So in craniosacral thought, this is called the long tide. The important thing is that the origins of our biological memory. So what we're trying to do is clear out whatever compensations or restrictions we put in the way of it. The origins of our biological memory, those begin in the oceans, in water. So we have like an oceanic feeling of breathing. That's how it begins. And there's an argument that says that we essentially took the ocean with us when we came out of the ocean as vertebrates. We're going to go through the evolution of how we encapsulated the ocean. But as you can see here, at your very core, so we've talked about the fascia, we have fascia on our arms, and it gets tighter and tighter and denser and denser. Maybe tighter is not the right word. It gets denser, more compact, more durable as you get deeper and deeper into the body, into the more important areas of the body. And then it gets really, really at its densest, the very protective membrane, when you get to your spine and your nervous system, your spinal cord. All of that density and protectiveness is wrapped around at the very core fluid, craniosacral fluid. Now, in the bottom right picture, you can see that there is actually a correlation, an evolutionary correlation, that the neurons in the radial nerves of starfish are like lancelets and those early worms, early types of life. They have similar contacting neurons that interact with the seawater as we have with the neurons that interact with our internal craniosacral fluid. So there is a very good argument for the idea that we essentially took the ocean with us, and we're gonna explore that a little bit more in the coming slides. I've been told that the composition of craniosacral fluid is actually very similar to the composition of oceanic water. So as we took the ocean with us, we took the oceanic breathing with us, we took the rhythm and the flow as well. So the same impulse that moves the oceans. And it's well known that, say, on full moon nights, crime goes way up. People with psychological disturbances tend to get worse in those ways on full moon nights. The same influence and ebb and flow, the same breathing that's in the oceans, that's in all water on Earth, that breath that's in everything. Of course, we bring that with us as we are part of the energy field, but it's very much in us in the craniosacral fluid. As I've said, that the craniosacral fluid has this motion of breathing. There's studies that show that the respiration drives the craniosacral fluid motion, and I would like to say that they both are tied together. They're not inseparable. One doesn't cause the other. They both go together, the same impulse. It's almost indistinguishable. Quite possibly, with the right instruments, you might be able to see one comes before the other, but they're going at the same time. The cranial sacral impulse, the deep breathing impulse, is what drives the breathing, which also drives the craniosacral fluid, which also drives the breathing, which they work together cohesively. And the fascial system, because this whole craniosacral fluid system is wrapped in the densest fascia, and the fascia runs through your whole body. So the body is actually it's more like 60%, high 60% water. The fascia is right about 71% water, which is right about where the surface of the earth is in terms of water content. And the fascia is extremely powerful. It's a tensegrity structure at transmitting force, transmitting movement, and transmitting the data of that movement. So when you have that impulse deep within the body, areas where fascia is really tight, you can imagine a web, say a spider's web, and if you pluck any part on that web, the whole web will feel it. But if there's a part in the web, say the center, where it's very, very dense, even just a little bit of movement there is going to turn into a lot of movement somewhere else in the web. And in that same way, at your most dense fascia around the spine, around the spinal column, the meninges, the dura mater, all that, just a little bit of fluid impulse, a little bit of breathing impulse there turns into a big breathing impulse throughout the body. That's how the fascia functions. It works mainly through the type of lines that are described in, say, anatomy trains, and those are the type of lines that we're going to be looking into in this module of the course. We're going to be exploring how to breathe with those lines. But even once you've understood how those lines work, it's still a whole body breathing pattern. Now, as we go into the evolutionary ideas, one thing that is well known to all of us, and I won't stay on this for too long, is that we can see in the evolutionary record that the function and mechanisms of a limb or part of the body might end up changing, and yet their primary function, to say for the arm to flap or to move or something, remains the same. And if we look back in the evolutionary record, we can see, okay, why do we use the arm in this way? What is the primary function of this organ? It maintains essentially the same type of primary function all the way as far back in the embryological and evolutionary record as we can look. What's really important, because I mean, it's the same genes, it's the same coding that you have and a sea anemone has, and you can see the sea anemone is essentially just a tube for seawater, which is analogous to your spine and your breathing mechanism. That the coding, the essential building blocks of how the life works, functionally should remain the same. There's no major. There are branching points, not for us. For other animals, they might breathe in slightly different mechanisms now. They maintain that this sort of breathing. They maintain the let's say expansion and contraction, ebb and flow. If you can think of a better way of describing what that breathing motion is, I would love to hear it. But for our evolutionary branch, very specifically, we all maintain that central tube of seawater and the impulse of breathing that basically is driven by the craniosacral fluid, by the fluid within our body at our very core. So how did we end up taking the tube with us? How did we take the water with us? You'll see in early development that you form a tube shape as soon as possible. And the animals that are on our evolutionary branch, and a lot of plants too, we all undergo the same basic level of early embryology, of early development, where so for us, we have ectoderms, we have mesoderms, and endoderms that will form different layers of our body, different functions of our body. And this will become important because for understanding how your body works as a tensegrity system, which parts are really supposed to breathe and take the brunt of the breathing function, and which parts are, more for organs. They have their own function that they do breathe, they are breathed into, they are breathed through, but their main function is not a structural function. So as you can see on the top right here, that's a sea urchin, and the early development for a sea urchin is essentially the same early development that you would have had. And here's just more to look at in the early embryological and evolutionary record of lamprey, sharks. We're going to look at sharks very specifically, chickens, mice. Um, on the bottom of that picture, you can see that the way the spinal cord ends up developing might be different in these different animals. So on the right side, you can see how in a worm, these like nematodes and such, it's a very simple tube essentially. They have their endoderm in the center, the mesoderm, the ectoderm. And when you get into more complex creatures like sharks, chickens, mice and such, the spinal cord, this notochord, this tube, might take on a more rounded vertebrae type shape, and yet it comes from the same source. The function is essentially the same. And importantly, in the bottom right here, you can see that the gill slits that are developed in these early animals. So as they move through the water, the nutrients that they need, the oxygen, the breathing that they have to do, is breathed into them by their movement through the water and the movement of the water itself. So this is an organism which is part of the environment. The environment breathes. It's moving in a moving ocean, and the animal itself is also breathing and it's moving in order to breathe as well. The entire body is part of this because as these early animals move through the water, that's how they pass the air or the water, sorry, over their gills in order to get that oxygen, get the nutrients. So while I think it's clear enough that the building blocks of the early animals become essentially the building blocks of our form and function, it's also important to note that the nervous connections, the way that the brain sees and operates those parts of the body, also remain to a large degree the same. So the same type of nerves that are going to the gill slits in a shark are still the same nerves that are going to your neck muscles as a human. Bring in this slide because you can see how the things that essentially on the right, you can see that early fish, they had some sort of sensory fluid-filled canal, a mechanism by which they could sense vibrations in the water, and that'd be like a primitive form of hearing. And for us, that developed into our jaw as well as our ear canals, which are fluid-filled. And this is also an important slide because one of the most important bones that we're going to be dealing with is the temporal bone, which is what the ear canal, the entire listening system sits within. And when you go deep into levels of silence and meditation, on top of the breathing, on top of the fluid movement, rather than on top, but as part of, I want you to be able to feel the sensory motion of the sides of the skull. How incredibly sensitive it is, and how when anything happens in your day-to-day life, so say a fish is swimming and it gets a sudden amount of pressure from the right side, you can imagine the reaction of that fish. And it'd be quite the same for you as a baby, especially, where you're just living your best life and all of a sudden a very loud noise happens and you're gonna respond and jerk in that way. And that respond and that jerking goes all the way down your postural chains and could jerk things out of place. And those things have to go back into place in order to ensure healthy function. If you get stuck in a sort of traumatic pattern and sort of a defensive pattern, it's gonna affect your ability to breathe. So as a human, you go from that egg that is essentially floating in the ocean, is floating in the testes, and then it's floating in the uterus. And then you become multiple cells, which are doing essentially the same type of thing that um, organisms in the ocean would be doing. They're floating in fluid. There's still respiration, there's breathing going on. They're taking in nutrients, they're expelling what they don't need. And then right after implantation, you essentially become a tube. You become a fish as quickly as you possibly can. You go through that idea of creating a mesoderm, ectoderm, endoderm. Um, from your mesoderm, you're going to get your skeletal muscle, organs, red blood cells. Ectoderm is going to become stuff like the skin cells, brain cells, hair, tooth, enamel, nails. There'll be more information about this in the written portion, and you can look into it for interest. In terms of actually trying to use the different parts to breathe, you can look at it mostly in terms of structure of the front and the back of the body. So you have the visceral cranium and like the viscera, the front soft portion of your body, and then you have the neural, the back part of your body. So that for breathing, you can essentially break it down into two. After you become an embryo, you become a fish, pretty much, like all of the other types of animals do, until you differentiate in your embryological development. And what's important is that the human embryo, and say, for example, this is a shark embryo, those are gill slits in a shark embryo. And those become indeed the jaws and the gills for sharks and for other fish and primitive creatures. And for us, they also become the structures of the jaw and the neck. And as we saw previously, the other portions which become parts of the upper jaw and the lower jaw, those also evolve from the same ones as does a fish. You can see that here. That on the left picture, on the right picture, you have essentially the evolution of the jaws from a fish, because remember, for a fish, these jaws are part of the eating mechanism, but they are also part of the breathing mechanism, because a fish moving through water is taking in the water through its mouth. They breathe with their mouth open, and that air is then going, or the water is then going through the gills to be processed. So the jaws of a fish are part of their breathing mechanism, and of course for us, the entire nasomaxillary complex is part of the breathing mechanism. It's what you take the air in from, same as a fish. And on the left picture, you can see, if just to clear up any confusion, the shark belly is facing the same as the human belly. They're facing each other. So the spine of the shark and fish, as they're moving through water, when they sleep, fish don't just go still. They maintain this movement because they need to continue having water moving over their gills. They are breathed by the ocean. There is, of course, the current flow that is happening, and their whole body is breathing in that way. And there's also a spinal movement to ensure that there is enough motion. There's enough water being passed through the gills, through the jaws, so that they can breathe properly. This is essentially more of the same to see how the development of a human parallels the same development of a fish, and how you can see quite clearly that the structures that would form the breathing apparatus of a fish also form our breathing apparatus. And you can see this in the arches of a human. So you have this upper arch across the teeth, you have a lower arch of the jaw, and actually this is how it works, that like this whole tracheal area, it's arches, it's a series of arches all the way down like gill slits. And you could extrapolate this all the way to the rib cage. I don't see a good reason not to also think of it as in that way. And on the left, you can see like the beginnings of a spinal cord. You start out as a tube of seawater, and then you fold over, and that becomes your head, your body, the structures of your body. So you maintain that being a tube of seawater that has that oceanic breath where the whole thing breathes at once. It is breathed. And you also maintain the breathing mechanisms that our early ancestors or early evolutionary ancestors used in order to filter seawater and take oxygen out of it. The nerves still look at those places as breathing places. There is still nervous activity and nervous impulses that are expected for breathing. One of the reasons say that it's so important to breathe from the nose is that you have nervous cells in there that do signaling to other parts of the body to indicate that we are breathing. We need to breathe in this way. We need this sort of nutrients. When your breath stops, when you hold your breath, your nerves can sense that there's no breath flowing here. We got to operate in a slightly different way. It's going to send signaling to all the other functions in your body that there's no breath coming in. And that also works for your hormonal glands, everything down this chain and throughout the whole body, in fact. So if the brain has nervous processes going down into these gill areas, into the neck, and it's expecting some sort of motion of breathing to happen from there, for these muscles to be frozen up and not functioning in the breathing is sending a very distressing signal to the brain. There's no water flowing over our gills. It's very bad for the nervous system. And of course, the vagus nerve as well, which goes all the way down through the neck muscle, through the chest, the heart, that's also expecting a constant signaling. And here's to show that the motion of the spine is retained into humans, that when you inhale, there is extension of the spine. And when you exhale, there's a flexion of the spine. So these extension and flexion movements of the spine are going to be very important for our course. And it's something that you should begin noticing, that when you breathe in, your spine does flex backwards, you go into extension. And when you breathe out, you go into flexion. Your spine lengthens on the inhale and it extends on the inhale. And this has been known in yoga. This is how Patanjali Yoga teaches Hatha Yoga, that when you inhale, for every movement of the inhale, you are doing back extensions, and then on exhales, you're breathing out. So again, this is something that if the yogic schools already understood, that you don't do a forward bend on an inhale, you do the forward bend on an exhale. You don't do your back bends, you do your back bends when you inhale. This is already well understood. And so for our theory, for our purposes, these motions are very important. That breathing of the craniosacral fluid, the breathing of the whole body that's driven by that breathing of the craniosacral fluid, as well as the movement of the body, the movement of the spine during breathing, which is again pretty much driven by this craniosacral fluid. Well, that drives the movement of the skull bones. And in our theories, we have the concept that rhythmic movement at the sutures is what drives bone growth, and a lack of that sort of movement will cause bones to jam together, and that's how you get synostosis. And in babies, it's very, very evident, and it could be for many reasons in babies. But as you accumulate traumas, as you accumulate a lack of spinal mobility, of brain mobility, of cerebrospinal fluid motility, as you grow older, then if that lack of movement develops into craniosynostosis and you get sutures fusing together prematurely, you could end up with not a fully developed craniosacral complex, nasomaxillary complex, and say asymmetries in the face, depending on where you're holding things tightly. And of course, again, this is important to our theory because the sphenoid bone and the cranial base, as you're developing, these sutures shouldn't ever really fully fuse. They should remain kind of soft. Everything in the body should retain that ability to flex and extend, and indeed they do. Even in adults, they do. So between the basal occiput, basal sphenoid, presphenoid, ethmoid, and the frontal nasal suture, that is essentially your cranial base. That is what the entire maxilla, as you can see on the right here, That is what it hangs off of. Your craniofacial complex is hanging off of this. So if this doesn't develop far enough, and this is accepted in science and in dentistry as such as well, that if this is not long enough, how can your maxilla in this entire area grow forward? There's nothing to grow onto. So in our proposition, in our theory, we're not developing the maxilla. We're not developing the jaw. We're developing the cranial base. And the cranial base, as you can see and possibly feel, it's essentially an extension of the spine. So that basis part of your occiput is essentially the basal, the top of your spine. It goes like that. And so when you breathe in, when you inhale, your entire spine lengthens. So the spaces in between all of these bones lengthens, and also you get an extension as well. And that healthy pattern, that continuous pattern, it prevents the bones from ossifying together prematurely. And if we can get that motion reintroduced of opening space between them, the same way you open space between your vertebrae on an inhale, these are essentially just a continuation of your vertebrae. Your skull is essentially just a specialized vertebrae. So getting those spaces opened again and getting the extension and flexion moving again, even if there is ossification, if it starts to bend and flex, you can think of like a piece of cardboard you're trying to rip in half, and you bend it, and the more you bend it, the more it's able to start flexing again. And in the same way, in the bones, you have the piezoelectric currents and such, that when the bone is living tissue, don't think of it as something hard. It's a flexible living tissue. And when it starts to get flexed and bent again, it's going to send the correct signaling to essentially open up those sutures, open up those bones, and let movement begin to happen again. And importantly, right at the base of your sphenoid here, you have glands. Right there in the sphenobasilar junction where we're trying to reintroduce movement and we're going to reintroduce movement with the breathing, you have the pituitary gland nestled inside of the sphenoid, and it's going to feel that movement. It's going to get pulsated and melt. And both the signaling within the bones and the signaling of the hormones, which like this, it's called the master gland because it can signal the other endocrine glands to basically produce whatever the body needs. And we're hoping that combination can ensure that you develop to full growth. So if your growth ever got stunted at any point, and again, in our theory, we don't think that it was downward growth. We don't think there was sideways growth. We think that all growth happens in the proper direction. It just can stop before it's fully grown. And again, here we have, so importantly for our theory, at the bottom right of this picture, you can see that essentially the spine becomes this cranial base. Can you see how it's just an extension? And the skull is like, if you look at a snake, say, the skull of a snake looks pretty much just like another vertebrae that's a little bit specially shaped. And it's essentially the same thing for your cranial base and your occiput and skull in general. It's a specialized vertebrae. Your entire spinal canal is holding your nervous system and the craniosacral fluid. Your skull is holding your nervous system and the craniosacral fluid. They're essentially the same function. It's just one is a bigger specialized one at the top. And this motion of breathing throughout the skull, throughout the whole body, as well as that front and back motion, this is important because we have the visceral cranium and the neurocranium at the back, and this becomes your, essentially your viscera down the front of your body, and the neural, the more hard tissue, dense tissue, the spine down the back of the body. And their breathing function together is what we're saying develops the craniofacial complex properly forward. So as you can see in this picture here, the middle bottom, that after childhood, pretty much all of the growth of the skull is happening in that visceral cranium. So the anatomy chains, the fascial chains that are down the front of the body, which are responsible for breathing to a large degree as well, those and the chains that are at the back of the body, those are antagonistic in a way. And so when the neurocranium, when you have that back extension, as that pulls away from the visceral cranium, you get that forward growth of the skull. We're going to go deep into that when we talk about tensegrity breathing, which is specifically trying to use the tensegrity structures of the body to achieve some sort of expansion or growth where we need it. And you can see that this distinction, this breathing distinction, is there ever since we're a tube, if you want to pause and read the picture that's on the left. So that has been the evolutionary, embryological, physiological, biological, essential theory and justification for why I believe whole body breathing makes sense. Looking back at how we breathe all the way from the starts of being an energy impulse, an organizational system that energy and form is created around, to being single cell life, to being life in the oceans, which is breathing among its environment, and all the way up until how those structures that were always used for breathing became breathing structures in humans, including the spine, which was a part of the breathing motion in fish and in animals. So in the coming lectures, we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking deeper at each individual function, and we're going to be trying to wake up various parts of the body to their proper breathing function. I think the entire body breathes. Every single part of the fascia, every single structure in the body is involved in the breath in some way. And when you have traumas, energy blockages, fascial constrictions, all the different ways of looking at it, muscle knots, those don't allow the breathing to happen properly through the body. And when the breathing can't properly happen through the body, the spinal movement and the craniosacral movement doesn't happen properly. So you end up getting compromises in the form. Form and function go together. So the function of the body is breathing. So when the function is disrupted in any way, the form of the body starts to also evidently display that sort of disruption. And they go hand in hand, chicken and egg. They both go together. One cascading collapse, basically. It becomes a snowball effect. And hopefully we can begin to wake those things up, release those energy blockages, the emotional blockages, the trauma. And we're not learning a technique again. We're not doing a practice. We're removing the obstructions to what your body already knows how to do. You know how to breathe. It's very deep within you, that impulse to breathe. And it runs through your whole body. Even right now, even if you're not breathing with your whole body, the parts of your body that are dormant, they're still getting the impulse. The nervous system is still sending the impulse, the electrical impulse, to breathe in. And if those muscles say we can't do it, then some other muscles end up picking up the slack. If some part of the fascia can't do it, some other part of the fascia it will pick up the slack. And that's great. That's the plasticity of the body. That's the incredible intelligence of the body. That's the incredible intelligence of the creator that's within you. And yet everything comes with a price. And if you are disrupting the form and the function of the breath, you will see it in your physical form and function. At the very least, as a physical issue, spinal issues, craniosacral, craniofacial issues, and possibly worse ones as, organs and other parts of the body, all these systems that are built on top of the breath, as those get disrupted.